We are continuing our conversation in the next hour. It will still be about, schools and looking at the disaster preparedness and management in schools. We know that there is a law in place, there is quality assurance in place, there is a matter of looking at whether schools are actually well equipped to deal with disasters and what happens in terms of disasters in their schools, which is why our next conversation is going to be about, now, are schools actually prepared to handle disasters? Is there such a thing? Do we have a policy in place? Do we have it in practice in our schools? Do we have it clearly outlined and articulated that this is what happens in the event of a disaster? This is who is in charge of disaster preparedness in this institution. We've invited Njoki Mwarumba. She is the academic lead for disaster management executive program at the Strathmore University Business School. Njoki, good morning.
Good morning, good morning.
How are you?
Very well. Couldn't be better. Good to be here.
Very good. Good to have you here. Welcome to the hot seat of the Situation Room.
Asante sana.
First thing to welcome you is City, giving you the day's proverb. This week, the proverbs are from one country that's somewhere at the Horn of Africa.
Yes.
And what else?
It has the largest coastline. Yes.
Largest coastline in Africa.
Yes.
In the entire African continent.
But mainland. Because we have countries that are island nations. Those are a different story. Yes.
You'd have a larger one.
Yeah, definitely.
Njoki, can you guess what country this is?
Somalia, is it? No?
She's spot on.
You got it.
Excellent.
Just like that.
Excellent.
Yes.
And I like how you've distinguished that island states should not fall in the
No,
measure.
they can't. No, they don't sit for this particular exam. Yes.
Yeah.
No, they'll be
Those ones
cheating.
are in the different class.
They're in a different class. Yes.
I've passed.
Now, listen to the proverb.
All right.
And then you'll give us your interpretation of it.
A mouth that doesn't belong to you cannot be shut up.
A mouth that doesn't belong to you cannot be shut up.
True.
What do you think the Somalis are saying?
Actually, it's more than just the Somalis that are saying it's actually a global phenomenon, and I can connect it to my field, which is disaster management, which is we have a concept of command and control, right? Where you think the approach is that you can command and control what people see, what people think, how they process information, how they respond. But we know that just like you cannot control a mouth that doesn't belong to you, then you seriously cannot control the way people think in disasters or respond. You cannot control that, and an approach to try and do that always ends up being problematic. And there's a context to that. But
Quite interesting.
Yeah.
What's the context to that?
The context to that is that historically, when you look at from disaster science, right? When you look at how people have tried to respond and control nature, for example, or tried to control how people respond in disasters, there has always been failure. It has not worked. When we have not worked with the indigenous natural systems of life and tried to rock those systems or challenge them or force them to go a certain way, or when in the very unfortunate case, of course, where we've had the recent fires with the schools, which is, I know, has been the topic of conversation, part of what is a dimension that really needs to be addressed is the ways in which we are trying to force command and control in a situation where a more cohesive, collaborative process needs to happen. And that can also be expounded a little further.
How does that work? I mean, so if you don't have command and control in the event of a disaster, I mean, first of all, what does command and control mean? That you have a head that is sort of like giving guidance and directions. This is how we are responding to this particular disaster. And you're saying that will not work.
Yes.
So what would work?
So
this
what I'm saying
collaborative
is
thing.
that will not work all the time.
Okay.
I'm also saying that you're right. It will work during the response phase. And that's where we have a major challenge, is that in our work with disasters, our focus is during the response phase, which is only one of essentially four, right? There's the mitigation and preparedness, then there's the response, which gets the most attention, and that's why we are here, and then there's the recovery phase. So during recovery, then command and control is certainly, leveraged, but it can only be leveraged to the degree that the recovery process that follows or the mitigation and preparedness has also been developed over time. So that, for example, when it comes to trust issues or knowing the community that you're working with, right, they already trust you and therefore can follow you, right? So as a leader, if you don't have that basis, it's going to become problematic.
It's a chain.
Let me tell you, it's
one
an
of those
ecosystem.
in that is not working, then
It's interconnected systems, and then in a weak chain or an unexisting one, attempt command and control, and it becomes very problematic.
Okay. So, I mean, let's, as difficult as it is, let's look at the nature of disasters here. And then, because you talk about command and control, and it would appear as though those two elements, in most cases, are missing. And one would also assume that command and control is only present while the disaster itself is happening and is not applied to response and recovery. So let's look at that. Mitigation and preparedness. What exactly do we mean? And of course, all of this is in reference to what we've seen in the last couple of days.
Yeah.
And even in months, what did we see with the fires that took place just here in Embakasi, the explosion? But then let's look at schools. Let's look at schools right now, because that's where the fire is burning, literally. So when we talk about mitigation and preparedness, what exactly does that mean?
Great question. I'm a teacher, right? So I really do have to. I really need to be sure and be concise about this. So, like I said, part of the largest problem that we have is that we really disaggregate and deal with disasters when they're in front of us on TV, on the radio, like we're doing. And then after that, this window of opportunity to discuss it, to do something about it, goes off, right? So the further you are from the proximate, event, the more you forget. So that's a given. That's what happens, very unfortunately, right? So mitigation is actually when you do the hard work. It's a process, right, of sitting down to do two key things, categories, right? There's the structural and the non-structural mitigation. Right? So when you look at structural mitigation, you're talking, in the case of schools, for example, you're talking about the things that we are obviously seeing in the papers, right? Proximity of beds to one another, the use of burglar proofing, the locking of doors, right? The kind of flammable materials that are existent in the schools and in our homes as well. But we're talking about schools right now, right? Structurally. Structurally, we are also looking to see where are these schools located. Okay, are they in an area, for example, if it's in a forested area or in a place where access by, responding agencies is limited, what does that look like structurally? And then that also has an assumption that there's responding agencies. One thing that, really breaks my heart in this case in Endarasha is that there hasn't even been, when you read the papers, there isn't even talk about the fire brigade came. Or the that people were put on ambulances. I haven't seen that. There wasn't that expectation. But when you look at the documents in place, we have response times in rural areas in Kenya are supposed to be at 45 minutes. For example, is there a picture? Is there evidence anywhere that actually happened? So those are the structural things. Do we have a responding agency, right, that has water, has fire engines, right, has roads, access roads? Those are the structural mitigation components relevant to schools in this case.
Do they actually take place? I'm sorry to interrupt, because I need to understand if there's an understanding across board. I got to think of an architect. When an architect is putting up a design and says, okay, if we're going to achieve natural light, it needs to be here.
Yes.
If we're going to achieve cross circulation, then it needs to be in this way. When schools, for example, are being constructed, built. Are these things taken into consideration? That should a disaster happen, do we have access roads? Is it in close proximity to ABC? Is that architecture taken into consideration?
Let me tell you, as a teacher, I know that on paper, that exists, right? Okay. On paper, that exists. It's there. And there's no lack of thought. And whether it's in school or just indigenous knowledge or common sense, we know to think about these things. We have it in us to think about it. The question, obviously, is always about enforcement, right? If you're not going to hold me accountable for the level of concrete I use, right, or the quality, then let's not question let's not question that the buildings are pancaking, right? And let's also understand and that these are not natural disasters. By no means. There's no such thing as a natural disaster. We as human beings are actively involved in creating conditions where we are ending up in disasters. And then if I may finish the non-structural component of mitigation, we have to look at the non-structural components such as policies, such as laws. Kenya today does not have in law written, signed, a disaster risk reduction document at all. It has existed as a draft, right? And more recently, the 2017 bill remains unsigned. So how do you hold people accountable for anything? How do you build capacity?
Just tell us a little bit. What is this bill that would cover this area of discussion?
It's the National Disaster Risk Reduction Bill. And right now it's at 2017 is when it was last, tabled, right? And it actually had some strong sponsorship, but it failed to pass right before the last elections. And that is a document which at a national level would provide us, a cohesive point of reference, right? Where we can look at allocation of funding, for example. We can look at capacity building. We can look at accountability. Those parents can have at least a guiding document to go back to see, hey, wait a minute,
were
right?
these things in place?
Yeah, were these things in place and were they enacted or not? But right now, it's a bit...
Before you go to the next, because I know you said there are 4 stages, in disaster management. So we are still at mitigation.
Oh,
You
for
said
sure.
structural, non-structural. It always baffles me because the question of, disaster management policy and disaster management laws has been discussed and it always dies in Parliament. Always. We don't have a disaster management authority. We don't have, policies in place. We don't have that law in place. And I ask myself always, why? Do you have any sense of understanding why this does not happen? Why have we not been able to enact these things?
There's a lot of complexities to it. First and foremost, I have to admit, as a professional in the field, that the document as it stands right now, really, you can see that there has been work that has gone into it. But for a current day document, 2024, it is really lacking in some
It's outdated.
Archaic.
Okay.
It is outdated in some very critical matters, right? And thankfully, there has recently been a call for public participation, and a team of people and myself that work together have submitted that once again. Hopefully, it gets some kind of review. But I think your question is as to why. Really, disaster management globally is an issue. It's very thorny, right? Because you're talking about people when they are on their worst day.
Most vulnerable.
Yeah, at their most vulnerable. And when you look at, coming back to mitigation, what really, really works in disaster management, because we cannot prevent all disasters, but we can, reduce the impact of so many of them. It's not a topic that is very popular with the politicians, because when you're talking about investing in a project that they cannot show as a shiny object within their term limited, 4 or 5 years, whatever it is, it becomes problematic. They want something that they can show very quickly. But when you're telling them to really invest in the, structural development, right? When you're telling people to invest in mitigation, which actually, if you invest in mitigation, right, the economic value of it roughly calculates to, and I'll use the dollar, is for every dollar you spend in mitigation, you save up to 13 in response, as we are right now. But that's the kind of thinking. It's almost like getting people to buy insurance, right? It's that kind of thing, right? And then there's also the concern about the funding, because we know that in the last allocation we had at least 45 billion shillings allocated to disaster risk reduction, right? And so when you follow through to see where that money is and where it has gone, a lot of it, unfortunately, has remained underutilized at the county level, which some of it could be used in, making our infrastructure, schools included, more robust. And then not only is it underutilized, as we all know, there's the money that is really seeming unaccountable. It cannot be traced, some of it. But then also you do have some counties, depending on capacity. So there's an issue of capacity that are able to really get this funding in some of the right places that it needs to be.
Okay. Mitigation. Next stage?
Next stage is preparedness. And even as I go through these stages, I need us to understand they do not exist in little cubicles where they're not interconnected. You're only as good as in the next stage as you were in the previous ones, right? It's an ecosystem. It's interlinked. So mitigation is the long-term strategic thinking, right? And testing and back and forth. And then the preparedness is knowing, for example, that rainy seasons are coming. We know, the science tells us what the rainy seasons are going to look like in this country, anywhere, right? And I'm just using one hazard as an example. And I say hazard, not disaster, because just because it rains doesn't mean we have to have flooding. Right? Doesn't mean we have to again expect that we're going to and lives are lost and people's cars are damaged. That doesn't have to be the case. So what happens in preparedness is that now you operationalize what it is you have been working on in your mitigation, whether it's time to dust up the documents for preparedness, whether it's time to start allocating funds and having them on standby, whether it's time to pre-stage because the rainy season is coming. Like I said, just because it rains doesn't mean it has to flood, right? Or just because we don't have rain doesn't mean we have to have a drought. The science supports that knowledge. So now it's a coming together. Again, it's not just what the government does, it's also what we do, right? There's an individual preparedness component to this as well, right? So what do I need to do about my home if there's a chance that, it could get flooded? Because we can't, all disasters are not, controllable. Like we cannot absolutely get
Give an
get
example
away
in the context of schools and school fires and school disasters. Preparedness.
Yeah.
What would that look like?
Preparedness in this case would look like this. Reading articles about, X number of schools actually have fire extinguishers, right?
Yeah.
Okay, who can use one?
Who knows where to pull the pin?
Yeah, who can use one? All right. So we go and check mark. We do our drills. There's a beautiful poster over there that says this is the meeting point.
Fire assembly point.
Fire. Blows my mind. There's a bucket with sand.
At the center of the fire assembly point.
How have we taken that next step, right? To actually work with our students. And I know every student is not going to be able to pull the pin. They're expensive, those things, right? But what about if you show them exactly how to do it? Do they know where to point the extinguisher
nozzle
at? Do they know that? Do you know that, right? Even in your own homes, do you know that, right? Preparedness also looks like, I really would like to honor someone like Chief Kariuki, the late Chief Kariuki, right? The tweeting chief from Lanette, who knew some of the very local resources available, so that even if it wasn't a fire, he would tweet and say, hey, kuna moto kwa mama flani, there's a fire at so and so's house, tafadhali endeni na blanketi, or someone has been attacked by bees. So figuring out what you have, the resources that you have, and how you can leverage that. So whether it's the matron being aware, don't lock the doors from the outside, don't lock the doors from the outside, things like those. That is what preparedness is, or the materials, the materials that are being used in the schools, trying to have some sense of control. But it's a very complex situation.
So who should be in charge of this, of preparedness? Is it the school principal? Is it?
It's us, all of us, right? Here's why I say that. Disasters are a reflection of our society. Disasters, in this case, a fire like this one is an indictment on us as a whole, right? Because we know very well, and if we didn't know, the Bombolulus of this world, of this country, and the prior events have taught us. We know we've had committees, that have done all these reviews. So there are so many points of failure, right? That honestly, trying to allocate blame, which is understood because of the pain of this event happens, but then there's too many of us that are culpable in this case. There's too many of us that are culpable in this case, right? It's not just whether there was a matron or not. It's not, the students themselves for whatever reason. It's not the parents for taking their students to a boarding school, because this is never a binary issue. It's not about whether we should go to boarding schools or not, right? It's a complex ecosystem approach that is possible to, if you eat it bite size,
But, talking about disasters in schools, huh? The disaster that we refer to in schools is when a building has collapsed, or it has been raised down. What has been most alarming is that those fires were caused by arsonists, and the arsonists in many of these cases, beginning with Changuli, were students. Reasons were given as to why. The question that I find interesting is, why had we not had fires before the year 2001?
Yeah.
Why did we have a period when we now started having fires? Schools had existed long before then. Before we go to the 21st century, we didn't have those fires. What happened?
Great question, because from us as a social scientist, we come back to having to look at what changed in those years you're talking about, right? We have to look at the students that we have. We have to look at the students. We have to look at the parents, right? We have to look at the country that they live in. And what is it that is causing them to think that the only option to get seen or heard or to express themselves, right? If they are as you said, they're the arsonists, right? What is it that is causing them to do that, right? And when you consider that and don't look at the students and again, just blame the students for it. They are responsible, yes, but there's a reason why this is happening. So when you dig down and to see why are they doing this, then we have a better understanding. What is it about their ecosystem that has changed? And that includes us as parents, right? Or the schools, or the larger environment. What is it about that has also changed? Because you're right. I went to school here for myself. I went to boarding school, but we couldn't even think about that. So what is that? What is that cause? So I might not have the complete answers. I have some guesses here and there, but then educated guesses.
But consider, because there are schools where the target was the library.
Okay.
Then there are schools where the target was the dormitory, where their own schoolmates were sleeping. There have been attempts at burning maybe a headmaster's house here and there. Some of them were not that successful. But the burning didn't take place because the students had a match. No. They had fuel.
Yes.
Something with which they could ignite. So
yes.
This is a boarding school. Students are only supposed to be out on weekend, regulated times. So how does a student get hold of a jerry can full of fuel and come into the school with it?
I love the use of fuel. There are multiple fuels.
Yes.
There's more than the one physical fuel that we see in a jerry can.
Yes.
These students are coming to school with different kinds of fuels.
Yes.
Right? These students are coming to school and experiencing different kinds of fuels as well. Right? And therefore they think that this is an option. They think this is an option, okay? Where maybe there's a pressure. There's a pressure from the home to perform in a certain way. There's dissonant. There's a lot of dissonance too that they're seeing, where it could be that you're pushing them to this education. I remember, mwisho wa masomo utapata kazi nzuri sana, sio? At the end of learning and education, you're going to, but then their real experience, they can see what's happening. They exist in this society. So coming back to us trying to understand why they are doing this, we need to really look at, what do they have? What's their hope? What is it? Why are they reacting like that? Because, throwing students in jail might not necessarily serve to address the root cause.
I have a theory. Prior to that period in time, if we go back to an earlier time, educators, teachers were perhaps some of the most respected and revered people in communities. And people who taught went into teaching more as a calling than as just a career option. Then we had a period when you were selected to be a teacher when you couldn't get what it is that you had wanted to get. So there is a whole generation of people. Some wanted to teach, like myself. Others were there because they didn't have an option.
Sure.
So students taught by people who don't want to be there will be taught in a certain way.
Correct.
Give these students a full cycle where they also get to university and then become teachers using the same system.
Precisely.
The very people who are supposed to help the administration in ensuring that the school is safe and is run well may be the very people who are influencing students to not only be dissidents but to be destructive.
Sure. That's a possibility. That's one possibility, right? That is one possibility.
Because it is very difficult to understand how a school where people are cohesive and people get along, students coming from families, they haven't burnt their homes. There's no history of them doing anything wherever it is they come from. They come to a school. Where on earth would they get these ideas? And this isn't 20 students. The numbers we often hear are not even more than 5 or 6.
It's always about the core group, right? It's
Yes.
always about the core
Yes,
group.
but
It's always
think
the
about
core
it.
group.
Somebody plans, these people plan, think, get something that they know is inflammable. Think this entire process, step by step by step by step. Those dorms are supposed to have teachers who supervise them.
True.
They're supposed
That's
to have
a point of
prefects
failure.
yes, they're supposed to have students, prefects who are supposed to oversee these things. There's supposed to be inspections to determine what it is that you have. There are all these safety measures. And we are saying that all these things
Failed.
yes.
Failed. Yes. And then we are also adding to that we cannot start looking at this problem at the point of inflammation.
No.
We cannot.
That's
We
a
cannot.
consequence.
Because then what you're doing is you are going back to just dealing with response, right?
Yes.
When we need to look at them, what's going on? What's in their minds? What do they need, right? And then also the possibility that it might not, all the schools have not been burnt by students, right? So what do those investigations tell us?
Question that you would ask is, have there been attempts that were thwarted and we do not know about it?
Thank you. Thank you. That's in disaster management, that's called near misses.
Yes.
When we also have to study near misses, because when you look at near misses, you see what worked. But if we are not looking at those that you so well put out, if we are not looking at those near misses to understand why is it that this did not happen in such and such a place, what was that point? If we are not aggregating that data to understand, what's working, then we are walking blind.
And then there are students who, by their very nature, are maladjusted. In every school, if you ask people who went to school, they know that fellow was a little off. they were not quite. They had sociopathic tendencies. They are known. They are people who are likely to do something quite bizarre. That is their leaning.
Absolutely.
And people who are trained to teach will be able to know and understand. This one requires a little more attention.
How to handle them.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. So
Yes.
you know.
So isn't that the story of society? In every society, even amongst us here, you never know. There could be this one person that is so way off, right? But what does way off mean and what does it need, right? So we are not without the knowledge or the resources to have people that can address those students. In those settings, the resources are there.
Njoki Mwarumba is an academic lead for Disaster Management Executive Program at the Strathmore University Business School.
So we're at the point whereby we're going towards response. And it's one of the 4 that you mentioned.
Yeah.
At the time where, I just imagine on Friday where everything was going crazy early in the morning. You don't know who's in there. You don't know if the fire is still burning. What are you actually supposed to do? But I want to go before that just a little bit. When you talk about documentation and procedure and policy that is in place, for example, do you think in your mind that all schools that have dorm facilities, boarding facilities, are aware that there's standard procedure that you should only have so many beds in a room, or that a particular kind of mattress that you should be using, or that when you're saying you bring your own mattress to school, we want it to be like this. or are we saying don't store plastic, like you have the buckets or whatever, don't store them in the room because these are natural flammables? Do you think that there's a knowledge or awareness across board of some of these things? Because that's some of the things that you teach, to say that there's certain things that should be nowhere near a living facility because of we're trying to do that thing where we don't say that it won't happen, but we're saying in the event that it should happen, we are trying to be prepared and reduce the severity of damage. Do you think such things exist even as we look at response?
Yeah. This some things exist, and then some things we assume exist and they don't, right? Because just because something is a policy, just because something has been put out by the Ministry of Education or even the national government as such, that doesn't mean it's being implemented, right? We know that. We know that, right? So the question becomes, why is it not being implemented? Okay?
Yeah.
So if, for example, the board of governors or a school principal has a level of autonomy, right, and bravado or whatever it is, impunity, right, with which they can make decisions and not be held accountable, then I can see where there's going to be, a disregard, total disregard for those directions, even if they know it, that they're supposed to. And then there's a very common assumption that people have that, it can happen here. How? We have this, we have that. So people focus on, but we have this, we have very strong boys, we have, that can do this, or we have. But then what you don't understand is that is really not your area of expertise. So, you're better off, dealing with having protected or tried to follow the protocol and not having worked for it, not maybe having worked in those rare incidences, than not, the kind of situation where we are seeing here. So it's a very common occurrence, right, where people just disregard it. And like I said, it's a reflection of society. If someone knows that they can get away with it, if people can have looked at the history and they have seen that such and such a person was accused of something similar and they got away with it. Now, the pain here is that we're dealing with parents who have lost their children that they took to school barely 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Right? So people do not make that connection, is understanding the implications that there are of the decisions that are being made. And then there's also the financial component. People sometimes are doing the math in their head. If I can get this bed, I can get a bed in here this way, that way.
I can have more students.
Or I can build a house over here in the middle or on top of this, but you're not, when I go to places, sometimes I just get nervous just looking at access, simple things like access. So unfortunately, people sometimes are really motivated by the money, right? And then we ourselves as parents want to take all our children to this one school because this one school performs in such and such a way. So if I come with a note from somebody who's deemed really important in this society, and there's going to be pressure if I don't take this student. Like I said earlier, my mother was a principal, right? And so when we knew we had December visitors, right, who came to see us in our home with letters from such and such, or who were friends of friends 10 times removed, right? And they were coming to talk to my mother so that during selection time in January, a couple of this, that, or the other can happen, right? We knew that growing up. So these are the pressures that the principals live with daily, right? So it could have been that, my mom got pressure at the house from friends, right? Or people from church. But what about the pressures I didn't see, which is the letters from maybe people who
Minister,
are in
MP,
so what do? You just tell them, okay, I'll accept them if you bring a bed. Where do you put that bed?
Actually, the question that I want to ask, and you laid it out well. Why is it that there were not more schools doing well?
Why is it that there were not more schools
doing well? Because if there are only a few, the pressure will be unsurmountable. Because having been a teacher, I knew of headmasters who were headmasters of these popular schools. There was a class they set aside for those requests.
Precisely.
Meaning those who qualify and go through the system of qualifying, you regular. Then one class. When you come with those requests, that is where you end up. Now, because this is one of the advantages of being old, you get to have lived a little longer than many people, so you get to see. But I was a teacher. You then realize that these so-called good schools had an advantage over the other schools.
Precisely.
It wasn't visible at first, but part of it was the alumni, the interest they took in their school. 2, the age of the school and people who had been in that school, the alumni, some who were in government, some who were where. So that school tended to get, those schools rather, preferential treatment in terms of the school, the students that they want, in terms
Even
of
the school
teacher,
head,
the resources.
the school head that is
the head,
posted.
precisely.
Yes.
Standards had to be maintained. Okay. Now, other schools would come up and would also be good. The constant in any of these schools, if you look at the educators, the teachers who are there, was the levels of commitment that you saw with the teachers. In the schools that do well, that is usually a constant, whether it's a private school or whether it's a public school. Now, what is it that made these teachers that committed? Because there was no joking about it.
Okay.
All right? And the students knew that this is a place where you take your studies seriously.
Correct. So.
And many of these schools that I speak of, you've never heard of a fire.
True.
Never.
So I know not to respond to a question with a question, but there's a question here.
Usually that's the best way to respond to a question.
What comes first? A teacher who comes into the institution committed, or a teacher who comes into the institution and realizes, here, these are the standards, you do not play. Okay? So then the other question becomes, why do we have this steered system that's so consistently colonial?
Yeah.
Right? Why do we have this system in the first place? Why have we not worked at that macro level, meso and micro level, to really make it to where it's about the quality of education across the board, and not similar, but equitably, right? So that if it's in the rural areas, right, that level of education is relevant for the students there. They understand, they're not being told that A is for apricot, right? They're being told A is something that is relevant to them. So why have we not contextualized education in that sense? And in doing so, you remove yourselves from the institution, the brick and mortar, or the place, the headmaster there, or the headmistress, or the principal there. It becomes about the thing. And the thing in this case is an education, a learning that is relevant and contemporary. And that makes sense to the person that is going to it. So the teachers come in also very aware. So when you look at our teacher development as well, when you look at our curriculum, okay, our curriculum.
Who creates the standards? Who creates that ecosystem that when you walk into, here, usually it's a head teacher, because there are institutions where you'll find there are standards, then they bring in a new head teacher and everything goes belly up.
Yes.
Head teacher. Very important.
Very, very similar to organizational culture. The organizational culture in this studio is dependent upon the leaders, right? So similarly, you will find that in different schools, it is going to be that way. Yes, it is the head teacher, but that head teacher has someone above them. They know they are accountable, whether it is to the alumni who are calling that head teacher to really stay consistent, or whether it's the Ministry of Education or what have you. So there's multiple systems.
Let me talk as a former head teacher. Those people don't really matter. Not really. If you have an interest in actually ensuring that these students do well, you will surpass the expectations of the board,
For sure.
the Ministry of Education. You will, because you're focusing, how do I ensure that this institution works and runs well and that the students do well? That's the focus. And it will show.
It will. It will.
And you can even turn around situations that previously people had assumed could not be turned around.
And you're going to have the resources to be able to operationalize that.
Yes.
If you do not have those resources, and that's why I'm talking about equity, not equality, equity. If you have those resources, then we're going to be able to protect those children that need to go to boarding right, schools from the catastrophic outcomes that we are having, because the resources are going to be within reach of the principal, the teachers, the matron, the watchmen, etc. down the line.
How to bring the conversation back to like schools and disaster management and response and preparedness now, right?
Yeah, preparedness.
Is there anywhere where people can get information? The people who are watching this and listening to this and they have children in school and they have relatives in school and they're thinking, okay, so how do I know whether that school is actually prepared for a disaster?
Engagement in the schools, right? And sometimes that it's so weird, because like we were saying here, sometimes people have already decided this child is going to this school by all means, right? So then it doesn't, the level of trust that you have that this child is going to be cared for is presumptive. It's very presumptive, right? So I did reach out to my mother yesterday to ask her, what she thought, and she said one of the things that has changed, she's no longer a principal, is that the level of parent engagement does need to be more valued and considered. But then the backslap to that is that the more some parents are involved, they're leaving their children in this school, they're seen as these activists, vichwangumus, and they don't know that what's going to happen to their students. So they kind of just get put in that box, which then continues to perpetuate the situations that we have where parents know, right, whether they visit the school or not, they could talk to their students and find out their children, but then what are they going to do? So the level of advocacy. But once you understand what the threats are, like right now, parents are really going to call to question and want to know what's going on in the schools. And then, like I said, over time, it's going to seem like it's getting better. And, all the recommendations and lessons that we're supposed to learn that we never learn, right, will have kind of been put together and have dwindled, gone off. And then the next time, and we are together, we're talking about something similar, right? And this is a constant. And it's the battle that people that work in emergency management and disaster management have to deal with.
Should disaster be included in the curriculum somewhere?
Absolutely, without a doubt.
How?
From the time, I'll give an example, and I'll use another country, not as a judgment call. But in Japan, for example, where we know that earthquakes are the largest hazard, right? When you look at the systems in place, going back to mitigation, structural and non-structural, they are relevant to that country, relevant to the people in the rural areas that live in the mountains, that live in the urban. So they have actually disaggregated that, the practices. And what you see is that when it comes to the curriculum, children are taught, because earthquakes are the prominent disaster hazard, right? They are taught what to do in the event of one. But not only are they taught what to do, the other systems, remember it's an ecosystem, its interdependencies are also key, right? So when it comes to, Ndu was asking about the architecture. When you look at the architecture in that country, it's such that it's responsive to levels of earthquakes, right? So you have a coupling of not just one thing, the curriculum, or because we have a disaster management office, you have it's a multiplicity, right? And in that convergence, then you have a better managed disaster. And that doesn't mean there's not going to be earthquakes in Japan where we hear about. They still exist, right? But even when they come, you can see that they used the ultimate information that they had, scientific knowledge, indigenous knowledge, the technology that is available, and the systems of learning too. The other reason I really like what you've talked about education is that you find that children have a way, once you teach children something and they understand it, right, they have a way of trying to influence their parents, and they might sometimes shame a parent, like, oh no, mama, you're not supposed to be doing this way, and you're like, this kid. But there's nothing, but then there's nothing you can do about that kid. That kid will insist, mama, your gas is almost running, or teacher said, or you need this, or you need this. So whether you want to hear it or not, you know that child knows something, and eventually that child might have a level of influence. at a minimum, that child knows. And that child also knows that this is the right thing, and you, as a parent, are choosing not to follow through with it, right? So there's that level. The syllabus question is key. We should be learning about it. And not just learning about, again, coming back to apricots, about hurricanes that are not
relevant.
What's the relevance? You know what? Yeah, and typhoons. It's good to know about them generally, but when it comes to the actual delving into material, it should be what's relevant to River Nyando that floods, you know, or you know, whatever the threat is, you know, at the time.
You know, at a certain age, children will listen to their teachers and take in everything they're told vis-a-vis what the parents tell them. The parent will say this, the child will say, Mommy, Daddy, teacher said.
Teacher said. Teacher said, and that should be the name of the program. Teacher said. Teacher said.
Njoki, thank you very much for joining us today. We still have some two issues, but we'll invite you again.
Would love that.
Yeah, come and let's learn more about disaster management and preparedness and all those things and mitigation measures.
Absolutely.
Because it's not just in schools. It happens. It happens at homes. It happens. Buildings collapse. So what do you do if a building is collapsing and you're inside, or you've been told that your building is collapsing and you know your children are there and you're not there? What happens? What do you do? We need to have regular conversations around this. So we'll invite you again.
Absolutely.
Njoki Mwarumba is academic leader for Disaster Management Executive Program at Strathmore University Business School. And we thank you very much for tuning in to Kenya's biggest conversation.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.